So I wonder, Matthew, would you mind just reading from verse 16 through and including to verse 21, please?
I say again, let no man think me a fool. If otherwise, yet as a fool receive me, that I may boast myself a little. That which I speak it not after the Lord, but as it were foolishly, in this confidence of boasting. Seeing that many glory after the flesh, I will glory also. For ye suffer fools gladly, seeing ye yourselves are wise. For ye suffer if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face. I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly. I am bold also.
Thank you. Come in. You all right? No, don't worry about it. It is. Come in. Okay. Well, we'll just crack on. We're looking at 2 Corinthians 11. If you want to follow, no, it's all right. Don't worry. 2 Corinthians 11, and we're going to be considering tonight verses 16 to 21. 16 to 21. So, whilst I'm just kind of do a little bit of an introduction, you could perhaps just be reading through that and just familiarise yourself with it. I actually think it's a very difficult passage. It really is. I think to get a hang on what Paul is doing here, he's sort of saying, I'm talking as a fool. Well, you start asking yourself the question, well, why is he doing that? Or why has he suddenly started doing this thing that he says, I wouldn't normally do this. I don't think it's a good thing, but I'm going to do it. So that's really what we're going to be considering tonight. And when Paul brings an idea, brings a comment or something, quite often it's not just in one small section. It's over a whole series of chapters. And so what we've done by chopping it up because of the time that we have, sometimes you lose a bit really of what Paul's saying. You have to go back over some of the previous chapters and piece it together. So what I'm going to try and do is, if you like, lay out chapter 11, or at least where we're up to, and also part of chapter 10. And I'm going to sort of dip in and out of those chapters and just pick on key phrases, key words that Paul's using, and then hopefully, a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, but when we put those into place, a picture will start to emerge of what's going on and what Paul's actually saying here. At least that's the idea. So in verse 16, where we started there, he says, let no man think me a fool. But if we go back to verse 1, he says, would to God you could bear with me a little in my folly or my foolishness. So if he doesn't want anyone to think him a fool, why is he being foolish? Why is he indulging in this folly? What I believe Paul is doing is something actually very clever. He is in effect saying, if you won't accept my wisdom, if you won't accept what I've been saying to you so far, and you think me foolish, then will you bear with my foolishness, and will you listen to that? He challenges them also. If you look at verse 19 there's a little reproof in there as well. He says, for ye suffer fools gladly. And it's funny that it's a phrase that we even use today. It doesn't suffer fools gladly. But he's saying, you, Corinthians, you suffer. In other words, you bear with, you allow to speak fools, people who are fools, who speak foolishly. You let them do that. Yeah? So he says, will you allow me to speak foolishly then? It's just a way of getting himself heard, saying, if you're listening to these people who speak foolishly, perhaps you'll hear me then. Perhaps if I speak foolishly, then you'll hear me. What he's saying is, if I have to stoop to this level for you to hear and understand what I'm saying, I'm willing to do that. And we'll find out as we go through why he's willing to do that. So I want to take it fairly slowly because I think it's a hard one to understand. So Paul makes it clear that he's about to speak in a way that he doesn't normally speak. If you look at verse 17 there, he says, "That which I speak it not after the Lord." In other words, I'm going to speak to you in a way that a Christian wouldn't normally speak or ought not to speak, but I'm going to do it. So since the Corinthians are willing to listen to those boastful false apostles, that's what we've been talking about over the last few weeks, isn't it? He's been highlighting the false apostles, those who said they were apostles of God, but he calls them false apostles, representing a false gospel. He said, you're willing to listen to those boastful false apostles, so if I act like them, will you listen to me? So if we go back to chapter 10 and verse 1, he said, I, Paul, myself, beseech you by the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. Now the false apostles had interpreted this as weakness. They said, oh well, he's so meek, he's so gentle, it's because he's weak. He's not a strong, personality like we are. He's just this weak guy, and therefore they were attributing it to his own lack of strength. But he says in verse 2 of chapter 10 that he said it was as if we walked according to the flesh. Paul says, no, that's not why I'm being humble and I'm being meek and I'm being gentle. It's not because I'm like that in the flesh, but rather we'll see that his meekness is not weakness, rather it's part of the fruit of the Spirit. Remember in Galatians 5:23, it taught meekness is one of the fruit, or part of the fruit of the Spirit. And so what Paul is doing is simply showing that the Spirit of God dwells within him, and this is how he conducts himself with the Corinthians. So what Paul does by now changing his tactic, by now speaking, as he puts it, foolishly or like a fool, he shows that perhaps extreme situations, when they occur, maybe it will be necessary to adopt extreme measures to deal with that situation. Let me give you an example of this. Go to the Old Testament, to 1 Samuel. It's 1 Samuel chapter 21. And I'll read from verse 10. 1 Samuel 21 and verse 10. It says, And David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul, and went to Achish the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? And David laid up these words in his heart, and was sore afraid of Achish the king of Gath. And he changed his behaviour before them, and feigned himself mad in their hands, and scrabbled on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. Lovely thought. Then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, ye see the man is mad. Wherefore then have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen, that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? And then verse 1 of 22, David therefore departed thence, and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. So it's saying David pretends to be mad because he's realising, hey, they're recognising who I am. These people are saying, hey, this is David. This is the king of Israel. And he thinks, well, they're going to kill me. And so he does something he wouldn't ordinarily do. He pretends to be mad, and they let him go, and he goes to safety, doesn't he? He goes and hides in a cave. So I think what it's showing is that sometimes in an extreme situation, maybe you would do something you wouldn't ordinarily do. So just as David pretended to be mad, Paul now pretends as it were, to be a fool and to speak as a fool, that they might hear him. Now, I think there's another thing going on here as well, or another possible reason why we're getting this situation occurring. And I want you to just bear with me on this. When you read the words and you read the phrases that Paul uses here, I think a sort of picture starts to emerge. And if I just show you what I mean, in chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians and verse, what is it, verse 2, verse 2, he says, I am jealous over you. And then in verse 11 he says, they ask the question, because I love you not, God knoweth. And then in verse 2, I have espoused you to one husband. So here we go. He's jealous of them. He loves them. You know I love you. I've espoused you to a husband. What kind of a relationship does that sound like? Does it sound a bit to you like a husband and wife relationship maybe? Or, like two people and he's saying, look, I love you. You know I love you. And I think what's happening here, a way of understanding what's happening is to see that Paul is speaking about Corinth as if Corinth is an unfaithful wife. This picture is used often in the scriptures, in the Old Testament with Israel and God or Jehovah, and in the New Testament it's used. We speak of Christ and the bride of Christ, don't we? And so, not only do we get a picture of Corinth as an unfaithful wife, but an unfaithful wife who has entered into abusive relationships. That she's sort of locked in these abusive relationships with false apostles. And I think if you start relating to it like that, it starts to make a bit more sense. And I'll show you what I mean as we go through. Let's just read verse 20. Keep that picture in your mind, this idea of this relationship. Here's an unfaithful wife. She's left her loving husband and she's now stuck in this abusive relationship. Verse 20 says, for ye suffer if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face. It could almost be a relationship, couldn't it, where somebody's just stuck in this relationship where they're just getting, completely abused, just taking everything off this person, just even down to physical violence. So what I think is happening here is, figuratively, Paul, who of course ultimately is representing Christ and the true gospel, is the husband reasoning with them. Normally if you're in a married relationship, normally you will not be sort of saying, now don't forget yesterday I cleaned the bath out, don't forget yesterday I did the garden, didn't I? Don't forget you were sick the day before and I gave you some flowers, didn't I? You wouldn't ordinarily be doing that with your partner. Why? Because you do it out of love. You don't want anything for it. You just accept that you do it because you love the person. But now I think it's as if Corinth, representing this represented by this abused wife, he's sort of like the husband saying, but I love you, but I did this for you, that I didn't ask for money off you, that I robbed other churches to pay. What he's doing is saying, I have to tell you this to make you see how much I love you, that I did all this stuff because I love you. And so what the Corinthians are guilty of is adultery, yet it's not a physical adultery, but it is a spiritual adultery, isn't it? Okay, look at verse 4 of chapter 11 there. Verse 4. For if he that cometh preacheth another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or if ye receive another spirit, which ye have not received, or another gospel, which ye have not accepted, you might well bear with him. So there is another spirit, another Jesus, another gospel. And we looked at it last week, verse 13. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. So these people pretend to be representing Christ, but actually are not. They're bringing this false gospel, this false Christ, and the way they're behaving is quite abominable, obviously, clearly from what he says in verse 20. And yet they'll bear with it. You Corinthians, you'll enter into that destructive, abusive relationship. You'll have that, but you won't have me, the one who really loves you, really cares about you, and really cares about your spiritual welfare. So it's a spiritual adultery. Let's look at some verses that talk about that. If you have a look at Jeremiah chapter 3. Jeremiah 3. And verse 20. Just that one verse. And it says, surely as a wife treacherously departeth from her husband, so have ye dealt treacherously with me, O house of Israel, saith the Lord. So again, there's this husband and wife picture, isn't there? You know, you've been treacherous towards me, like you've departed from me, like a wife departs from a husband and leaves him. And then again, Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah 1 and verse 21. Just really the first part of it there. How is the faithful city become an harlot? So again, there's the the city. I think it's the city of Jerusalem there. Being compared to a harlot. So this is quite a common theme in Scripture that's used. This idea of departing from God, and either the people becoming involved in idolatry, or as in this case, following after false doctrine and false apostles. And it's seen, God sees it as adultery. And again, James comments on those who say they're following Christ, but they're also following the world. It's this duality. This, instead of keeping a single eye, like Jesus says, they've got like one eye over here, one eye over. They're trying to live two lifestyles simultaneously. The Corinthians are not even doing that anymore. They're just following the false apostles. But he's trying to come in now, Paul, and say, look, this is really unfaithfulness to Christ. So. So we'll have a look at 2 Corinthians, coming down to 2 Corinthians 21. 2 Corinthians 21. And it says, I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, wheresoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. So, what's he saying? Well, the false apostles had brought a reproach. We read a little bit of it before, that Paul and his fellow apostles were weak. They say, well, these Paul and those that are with him, they're weak. They're not as strong as we are. Now, what they meant by that was that Paul and his fellow apostles were not dominating them. They were not lording it over them. They were not extorting money off them or anything like that. They were gentle. Remember, and Paul says, 2 Corinthians 10, verse 1, I beseech you with meekness and gentleness. They were humble. They were gentle, not like the false apostles. The false apostles say, it's because they're weak, you see. And Paul sort of plays a little trick here, and he says, well, yeah, that's the kind of weakness I'm happy to admit. If you want to call that weakness, then that's what we were. Because he doesn't want to be like the false apostles anyway. He doesn't want to dominate them. He wants to disciple them and encourage them and nurture them and feed them and teach them and so on. But now what Paul is going to do And why is he doing that? Why did he come meekly and gently? And why did he not take any money off them? But remember, the church in Macedonia actually paid for him, and he worked as a tent maker just to take the burden off them, just so he wasn't burdening them financially. And he was saying even the church in Macedonia, who were a poor church, he said they were paying. Why? Because I love you and I don't want to put an unnecessary burden on you or something that's going to be a stumbling block to the gospel. But now he says, all right, now I'm going to show you my boldness. He says, because you think this is weakness. You've been told this is because I'm not strong. And so now he says, whilst I'm forgetting all my scruples to do this, but it seems necessary for your good to do it. So now I am going to be bold. I'm going to reveal, in a sense, in an extraordinary manner, my great strength and the exploits that I have done in Christ. I will reveal to you those things that will basically confound and completely eclipse everything that the false apostles have told you they've done. I'm going to actually totally shame them and show them up, and that's what we're going to look at, but not today. We'll look at that next week. But that's why I believe he's taking up this stance, this, I'm speaking foolishly and, I wouldn't do this, is because he's driven to a point where he feels this is the only thing that I can do, And I think it's an expression of Paul's genuine Christian love for them that he's willing to do it, even to go against his principles, just out of love and concern for their souls, as to what's going to happen to them as a church, that he's willing to lay down those principles and do that. I think there's a lot of lessons for us here as well, that we look for natural leaders quite often, I think, and you see it with Samuel, and when he comes to anoint Jesse's sons, and he looks, I think, so surely this is the next king of Israel stood in front of me. Why? Because the guy's tall, because he's tall, strong, good looking, whatever. But God says no, it's not him. And they have to even call in David, don't they, from keeping the sheep. He's not even in the lineup. But he says, is this all your sons? No, there's one more. He's looking after the sheep. Well, bring him here. And the Lord says, that's the one. Just turn to 1 Corinthians a second. Let me see now, just reminded him. Yeah. So Paul is adopting this foolishness, being foolish, and this is quite interesting. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 25 says, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. For God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and the things which are not, to bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. So God chooses those people, the nobodies, the nothings. Paul indicates that he didn't come with any kind of, amazing, eloquent gift. He just spoke clearly, plainly, but the power of the Spirit was with him. And so I think that's what God has shown over time, is that he uses people. I mean, the Apostle Paul, they say, how they know, so I'm not quite sure, was not a tall man. Again, people like John Wesley, quite short, really. So what it's saying is, it's not the one who looks like, wow, look at that amazing, impressive person there. They look nothing, but it's the power of God in them. It shows more clearly that it's actually the Spirit of God working. That's where their strength comes from. It's not in their own physical, charismatic presence. It's just simply the Spirit of the Lord. And that's why God does it. So they can't say, what an amazing man. What they can say is, what an amazing God.